Over the past 2 centuries, why has there been such a strong bond between America, the British people, and the Jews in the Middle East? Few people realize that this unique and special relationship is actually rooted in the pages of Bible history. Today on the Trumpet Daily, we examine the traditional brotherhood of the American, British, and Jewish people.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. The New York Times recently reported that the United States is facing the prospect of having to share or even cede its decades-long role as the architect of Middle East peacemaking. This is a huge development that will profoundly impact not just the Middle East, but the entire world. Of course, one reason this is happening is because America's power and influence around the world is in rapid decline. But another, lesser-known reason has to do with the weakening alliance that used to be so strong between the United States and the Jewish people. Why has this bond between our peoples been so strong over the past 2 centuries? And more importantly, why has the relationship been unraveling in recent years? For answers to these questions, we must turn to Bible history and prophecy. For the main message today, we'll be playing a segment that we recently filmed from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Hello everyone, I'm speaking to you today again from Jerusalem. On May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion announced the birth of a new Jewish state. 11 minutes after Jewish leaders had signed Israel's declaration of statehood, U.S. President Harry Truman recognized and publicly welcomed the newly created country. America was the first nation to embrace the new Jewish state, just minutes after its establishment. Ever since, the United States has been Israel's closest friend and most enduring ally. It's important to note, too, that the relationship hasn't been one-sided. Since its creation, Israel has been America's most important ally in the Middle East and North Africa. Ideologically, the two countries share many of the same values and standards. Both have democratic governments, both embrace the rule of law, and both are founded on Judeo-Christian morals. Regionally, and on the global stage, both Israel and America have been longtime partners. America provides critical moral, political, and military support to Israel, which is surrounded by nations that refuse to recognize its existence. Meanwhile, having Israel, a pro-American, politically and financially stable friend in a region filled with anti-American sentiment, has been indispensable to America's national interests. Israel, as one former Secretary of State once put it, is the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, does not carry even one American soldier, and is located in a critical region for American national security. In a speech before Congress in March, Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated that Israel is of extraordinary value to the United States. Israel, he said, is absolutely critical to U.S. national security. Israel and America are financial partners, too. In fact, the first nation America ever signed a free trade agreement with was Israel. Between 2000 and 2009, direct U.S. investment in Israel totaled $77 billion. During that same period, Israel invested $51 billion in the United States. America's historic support of the Jewish state extends beyond its leaders. Since its creation, the American public has staunchly defended Israel. One Gallup survey taken in February showed that 2/3 of Americans sympathize with Israel. Without America firmly by its side all these years, the Jewish state would not exist as the thriving, independent country that it is today. These two nations are more than friends. What they have is more akin to a brotherhood. Sadly, in recent years, the brotherly bond between these two countries has weakened significantly. America's support of Israel today is not nearly as strong as it once was. The relationship over the past couple of years, at least between the political leaders, has been marked by tension and discord, by arguments and skirmishes. The brotherhood, it seems, is coming undone. Did you know this was prophesied in your Bible? That's right. The ancient prophets warned more than 2,500 years ago that the brotherhood that existed between America, Britain, and the Jewish state would crumble. And once isolated and abandoned, Bible prophecy says these countries, which were once so powerful, would be left isolated and abandoned, alone, which would leave themselves then wide open to enemy invasions. Today we'll learn more about the remarkable history of this brotherly relationship, as well as the prophesied breakup of the American-Israeli brotherhood. Some people assume that America's enthusiasm for a Jewish state came about largely as a result of the horrible atrocities committed against the Jews in World War II. In fact, U.S. support for a Jewish homeland can be traced all the way back to America's earliest beginnings. Many of America's pioneers saw themselves even as a kind of new Israel. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin even wanted the seal of the newly formed United States to depict Moses leading the Israelites into the Promised Land. America's second president, John Adams, wrote that he wanted to see the Jews again in Judea as an independent nation. Later on, Abraham Lincoln endorsed the noble dream, as he said, of a Jewish nation. A little while after him, Theodore Roosevelt endorsed Jewish control of Palestine and a Zionist state around Jerusalem. In the early 20th century, President Woodrow Wilson supported the Balfour Declaration, which called for a Jewish state. He later wrote that he took great pride in the opportunity to be able to help restore the Holy Land to its people. Then in 1962, President John F. Kennedy told Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, "The United States has a special relationship with Israel in the Middle East, really comparable only to what it has with Britain over a wide range of affairs." Most people would agree that there has been a unique and special quality to Israel's relations with America and Britain. Both the U.S. and England were vital to the creation of Israel as a state, and both have been strong allies since Israel came about in 1948. But what most do not realize is that the reason this relationship has been so strong, so close, so enduring, can actually be found in the Bible. In fact, the brotherhood between these three peoples, the Americans, the English, and the Jews, has been intimate because of the historical ties rooted in the first book of the Bible. The Bible clearly explains that the ancient descendants of America, England, and this little nation of Israel were actually blood relatives. If you trace their origins all the way back, you'll discover that America, that the English, and that the Jews all come from one family. One family. Let's notice Genesis 32 to begin with. In this passage, Jacob, his two wives, Leah and Rachel, and his 12 sons are returning home to the land of Canaan. And on his return home, Jacob, you might remember, wrestled with an angel all night long, with his hip out of joint much of the night. And God happened to be really impressed with Jacob's tenacity, with his fierceness, with his perseverance. And in verse 28, an angel, speaking on behalf of God, tells Jacob this, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince have you power with God and with men, and have prevailed. And so, from this point forward, Jacob went by the name Israel. Now, Israel had 12 sons, as all of you know, all of whom married and started families of their own. In time, each of these families expanded into tribes. And together, these families, all 12 of them, formed the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, all of them were Israelites. In the United States and Britain in Prophecy, Herbert W. Armstrong explains how the modern peoples of America, Britain, and Israel all trace their origins back to one of these tribes. We're all descendants of Jacob, in other words. In Genesis 29 and verse 35, it says, Leah conceived again and bare a son, and she said, Now will I praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah and left bearing. So when he was of age, then Judah married and had children of his own, and the years passed on, of course, and the family of Judah multiplied greatly, and by the time of the Exodus, the family of Judah had grown into a large tribe of its own. Then when the time came to inherit the promised land, each of the tribes was allocated a certain portion of property or land, and once settled, each tribe then continued to expand and to grow. Now in the Bible, the term Jew and Judah are virtually synonymous. A Jew, according to the Bible, is very simply a person descended from the tribe of Judah. In fact, there are scriptures where Jew and Judah are used interchangeably. You can see that for yourself in Ezra 5 and verse 1, and also in Jeremiah 40, verses 12 and 15. Now, if the Jews descended from Judah, what tribe did the English-speaking people of America and Britain descend from? We came from Joseph, as Mr. Armstrong explained, in the United States and Britain in Prophecy. Now, I know for many of you viewers, this is very basic information that I'm reminding you of, but so few people understand this today. I mean, they just assume that Israelites are Jews, that all Israelites are just Jewish people. But in fact, the Jews are only one tribe of the Israelites. And that's why Mr. Armstrong's book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy, is so essential to your overall understanding of Bible prophecy, because it tells you where the other tribes are, who they are primarily, along with the Jews. The Jews are identified. They're easily identifiable today. But what the world doesn't see or identify are the other tribes. In their minds, they're lost. Even Jesus said, go to the lost tribes of Israel. That's what he told his disciples to do. Now notice Genesis 48. Genesis chapter 48. In this passage, Jacob adopts the lads, Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons, as his own. And verse 5 says this, And now your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto you in the land of Egypt, before I came unto you into Egypt, are mine, as Reuben and Simeon. They shall be mine. You see there where in God's eyes, and in Jacob's eyes, obviously, Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were considered separate tribes. Now here in Genesis 48, we read about God bestowing a very special promise, one he had originally made to Abraham, on these two lads, Ephraim and Manasseh. It was called the birthright promise, which was a promise of material and national greatness. In verse 16, God says that Manasseh would eventually become a great nation, and that his younger brother, Ephraim, would become a multitude, or a commonwealth, that means, of nations. Now, with a little study, as I say, you can very easily prove that America today is the descendant of Manasseh, while the English-speaking peoples, or the English, are the descendants of Ephraim. But the main point that I want for you to consider is that the forefathers of the Jewish, American, and English peoples, Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh, all came from one family. Now this helps to explain why the sense of brotherhood that has long existed between these three nations has been so strong. But today, as I said at the start, I mean, we see that bond breaking before our eyes. It's been happening slowly for some time now. But in recent years, as I'll explain here in just a second, In recent years, the fracturing of this relationship has definitely intensified. A few years ago, we wrote extensively about the conference of Middle East leaders that President Bush hosted in Annapolis. That was back in 2007. And leading up to that conference, the Bush administration was desperate for some kind of progress to be made in the peace process before Mr. Bush left office. And so the outgoing administration intensified its pressure on Israel, primarily to give up East Jerusalem, to leave the West Bank, and to turn these areas over to the Palestinians. Now, that conference clearly revealed a deepening rift between American and Israeli governments. As Carolyn Glick noted in the Jerusalem Post, the Americans have sided with the Palestinians against Israel. Now, in the end, the conference obviously didn't result in peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but what it did do was inflict a terrible blow to the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Now fast forward to the next U.S. administration. In June of 2009, we wrote about this quite a lot at thetrumpet.com. President Obama traveled to the Middle East and gave a much publicized speech intended to mark a new beginning in U.S.-Islamic relations. And in doing so, what he ended up doing was driving a bigger wedge between America and Israel and its once very special relationship. During that speech, President Obama indicated that the historic bond between the U.S. and Israel was based on Jewish aspirations for a homeland that were rooted, as he said, in the tragedy of the Holocaust. In fact, as I pointed out at the top of the show here, our roots are much deeper than that, as we've seen. In the same speech, the president never once mentioned Iran or its radical desire to annihilate Israel. And as my father wrote in the Trumpet magazine, he said, Iran is the most important part of that subject. Iran is the king of terror and makes the Middle East tremble. But President Obama didn't even mention the word terrorism in his speech. That's from August of 2009, the Trumpet magazine. In effect, the president sent a clear message of capitulation to Iran and radical Islam. The president said, no single nation should pick and choose which nations hold nuclear weapons. Think about that for a second. No one should decide who gets nuclear weapons or not. What a signal this was to the rest of the world that America's superpower status is fast fading. Meanwhile, the President of the United States helped to legitimize some popular Arab propaganda that claims the Jews have no legal or historic right to their homeland, and that modern-day Israel exists only because of the guilt left hanging over Europe after the Holocaust. The president then criticized the natural growth, as he said, of Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria, as well as Jerusalem, the suburbs around this city. He said, it is time for these settlements to stop. That's what he called upon Israel to do, and that led to really a series of more difficult exchanges thereafter. And of course, it's not settlement activity or settlement growth that's obstructing the peace process, really. It's actually the presence of Jews in this area. Most Palestinian leaders remain steadfast in their aspirations for a homeland that includes all of Palestine, from the banks of the Jordan River to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, being ethnically cleansed of any Jewish presence. That's their goal. And that's the biggest obstruction there is of all to the Middle East peace process. Now, a few months after the Cairo speech, the White House again made the settlements a central issue in any peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. In March of 2010, tensions peaked again when Israel announced that it had approved of additional homes to be built here in East Jerusalem. Now, this decision, though routine in many ways and entirely legal, came at a very difficult time. It was just as America's vice president happened to be in Jerusalem trying to kickstart the peace process. Well, Israel's prime minister said he didn't know anything about the decision. He quickly apologized for the fact that the announcement was made right there at the beginning of the vice president's arrival. And it initially looked like the incident was over and done with. But the day after the vice president returned home, America's Secretary of State upbraided Israel's prime minister during a much publicized 40-minute phone call. And then later, a State Department spokesman publicly questioned Israel's seriousness with respect to the peace process. 2 days later, 2 days after that, President Obama's senior White House official said the housing announcement was insulting to the United States. And others along the way claimed that the ill-timed announcement threatened to undermine or to derail the entire peace process. Just one announcement about some housing projects here in this city. So after all of this, the Prime Minister of Israel apologized again and said there was a regrettable incident that was done in all innocence and was hurtful and which certainly should not have occurred. That's what Prime Minister Netanyahu said. But notice what reports came in after all of this happened. The Associated Press called it one of the worst feuds in memory, one of the worst feuds between Israel and the United States. The Los Angeles Times called it the biggest clash in 20 years. 20 years! Now move forward again a little bit further. More recently, we see that tensions flared up again between the U.S. and Israel when the Israeli Prime Minister visited the United States this time in Washington. And now, as if the tables had turned, the day before he arrived, it was President Obama this time who came out with some public remarks that really put the Israelis in a difficult position. He said that the establishment of a Palestinian state should be along 1967 borders. And this was the first of its kind, the first statement of its kind by an American president. And not only does it stand to fundamentally alter the foundation created at preceding peace negotiations, but downsizing the Jewish state to the 1967 borders would effectively be national suicide for this nation. Without some measure of control over the strategically vital West Bank and East Jerusalem, the nation of Israel would be indefensible, pure and simple. There'd be no way that it could defend itself against attacks from radical Islamic enemies. The president also said the Palestinian people must have the right to govern themselves and to reach their full potential in a sovereign and contiguous state, meaning the Gaza Strip would somehow have to connect with the West Bank. Now, I'll just leave it to you to go and find a map of the Middle East and see what a contiguous Palestinian state would mean for Israel. What would that mean for Israel? Well, after those remarks, it led to an uncomfortable exchange between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu the following day, I think it was. And then later on that trip to the United States, President or Prime Minister Netanyahu then gave a speech before Congress, a strong speech, where he said this: "If Israel simply walked out of the territories, the flow of weapons into a future Palestinian state would be unchecked. Missiles fired from it could reach virtually every home in Israel in less than a minute." I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that, he said. Imagine that right now, he's speaking to Congress in Washington, D.C. He said, imagine that right now we had less than 60 seconds to find shelter from an incoming rocket. Would you live that way, he said? Would anyone live that way? Well, we aren't going to live that way either. Those are strong words. And again, it illustrates just how difficult the strain is between these two brothers who used to be so close. Who can deny that this once close brotherly relationship between the United States and Israel is unraveling before our eyes? Now, this was prophesied. Just as we can look into the Bible for understanding about why these nations were once so close, we can also go to God's Word to learn why the two peoples are drifting further and further apart. Notice Zechariah chapter 11. Zechariah 11, the book of Zechariah is filled with many prophecies having to do with the end time. And in Zechariah 11 and verse 14, it says, "Then I cut asunder mine other staff, even bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel." Now, we've written about this specific prophecy a number of times at thetrumpet.com. The band between these brothers is breaking. That's what he's talking about there. And the prophet Isaiah adds to that. Also in a latter-day prophecy, over in Isaiah 9 and verse 21, he said, Manasseh shall devour Ephraim, that's the United States and Britain, and Ephraim Manasseh, and together they shall be against Judah. That's from the New King James Version. What a perfect description of the present-day relations between Israel, America, and Britain, or the fracturing relationships. These nations are family. Historically, they've been the strongest of allies, each of them a critical partner to the others. But today, America and Britain are turning on each other, and together, the two of them, they're against the Jewish state. And the Bible reveals that this will not end well. Now you go over to Zechariah 14 on your own time and read the first 2 chapters there and see how that this is building to half of this city falling into the hands of the Islamists. Half of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, that's where it's leading. And it's going to send the Jewish state looking for help in Europe as opposed to in Britain or the United States. They're going to go to Europe for help, which is a grave mistake, as we've pointed out in our literature. But why do they go to Europe and not to the United States or Britain? Well, it's because of the relationship. Then at that point, it'll be completely severed. Let me read to you what we wrote back in 2004 in our magazine, The Royal Vision. It says, if the brotherhood between superpower America and the Jewish state is broken, that is probably when half of Jerusalem would be taken. The Arabs would realize the Jews have no one supporting them, and then Judah really will see their wound. Hosea 5 and verse 13. They will realize that all their peace treaties with the Arabs were worthless. The peace treaties only wounded Israel, making them more vulnerable. They never produce peace, and they'll go right into the arms of Germany, one of their greatest enemies, historically, to try to solve their problems. That's where this is leading. They won't have America to go to, or Britain, and so they're going to go right into the arms of Germany, and that's going to lead to even worse problems than losing half the city of Jerusalem. This is Stephen Flurry reporting to you from East Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. During his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, Winston Churchill described the alliance between the United States and Britain as a special relationship. This brotherhood among 3 peoples, the Americans, the British, and the Jews, has been intimate the last 2 centuries because of historical ties rooted in the very first book of the Old Testament, and because of God's hand in establishing these end-time nations and raising them to unprecedented heights of world power. Everything you need to know about why this historic relationship has been so special can be found in Herbert W. Armstrong's book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. Now, when you call, also request this new packet, the latest in the Trumpet Daily reprint series. It's titled Band of Brothers. Call today and ask for Band of Brothers, as well as the United States and Britain in Prophecy. You can also order these online if you like at thetrumpetdaily.com.